Alexei had always dreamed of a weekend when he could be alone, without parents, without responsibilities, without constant supervision. When they had announced their sudden departure to their relatives for 2 days, he had barely contained his excitement. The old house on the outskirts of town where they lived seemed like the perfect place for such an adventure. The first night was spent in the spirit of complete freedom. Video games until deep into the night, horror movies he'd long wanted to watch, and pizza for dinner. The house, usually full of life, suddenly fell into silence, and Alexei savored every moment. But when he went to bed, strange things started happening in the house. At first, it seemed to him to be the result of an overabundance of impressions from the movies he had watched. However, as time passed, the rustles and sounds became more and more distinct and disturbing. Alexei tried to convince himself that it was just a branch scratching a window or old pipes. But in the back of his mind, he felt that it wasn't. Each time he got up to check the source of the noise, he found nothing but empty, dark rooms where the silence seemed even more deafening after his footsteps. On the morning, met with no sleep and full of inner tension, Alexei discovered the first inexplicable traces. The prints of dirty hands on the window in his room. Although all the doors and windows were closed from the inside, he spent that day trying to distract himself and explain the night's incidents logically. But an inner voice told him that the next night promised to be even more disturbing. After the first restless night, Alexei decided to approach the matter more prepared. He checked all the locks, made sure all the windows were closed, and even found an old baseball bat to feel more confident. He decided to spend the evening without horror movies, opting instead for a couple comedies, hoping the lighter atmosphere would help him relax. But as soon as the clock struck midnight, it started again. First, it was the subtle rustles coming from under the bed, then the creaks of the floorboards, as if someone was moving very slowly from corner to corner of his room. Alexei sat on the bed, straining to listen to every sound. The baseball bat in his hand seemed laughably useless against the unknown threat. At one point, he felt a strong urge to hide under the covers like he had as a child. But instead, he turned on the desk lamp and stood up resolutely. Enough, he thought as he headed towards the source of the sounds. Each step seemed to echo loudly in the silence of the house. After looking around the room and finding nothing but his own shadow, Alexei decided to check the rest of the house. He headed first to the living room, where the faint light of a street lamp through the curtains created eerie shadows. It was just as quiet as his room. As he made his way into the kitchen, he suddenly heard a new sound, what sounded like a low whisper. Alexei's heart hammered in unison with that whisper. He stopped, trying to figure out where the sound was coming from. Cautiously, he headed toward the source, the refrigerator. The whispering stopped as soon as he got closer. Opening the fridge, all he found was cold air and the remains of last night's pizza. Must be old pipes, he tried to convince himself as he closed the door. Walking back to his room, he felt the tension subside a little. Maybe all those sounds were really a figment of his imagination, heightened by fatigue and excessive impressions. He decided it was time to go to bed, hoping for a peaceful night. But the tranquility was short-lived. Just before dawn, Alexei was suddenly awakened by the feeling that someone was looking at him. The room was completely dark, and he couldn't make out anything but the dark outlines of the furniture. However, the feeling of presence was so real that Alexei had no doubt. He was not alone. This night had changed everything. Now Alexei knew something was going on, something that wouldn't give him peace and couldn't be explained by logic. He had to find the answers. After a second sleepless night, full of uncertain rustles and quiet knocks, Alexei met the morning in a state of deep anxiety. The whole house seemed to him now alien and hostile. With the first rays of the sun, he decided to inspect the house in the afternoon, hoping that daylight would dispel his fears. The first thing he did was to go to the window of his room, where he found handprints. In the light, they seemed even more mysterious and disturbing. It was inexplicable how someone could have left them outside, for his room was on the second floor, and there were no marks under the window to indicate that anyone had stood under it or used the stairs. Then, walking through the house, Alexei noticed that some things were out of place. The books on the living room shelf, which he always kept in strict order, were scattered. There was a cup on the kitchen table, although he remembered that he had put all the dishes away in the cupboard. But the strangest thing was that on the floor in the hallway lay a man's shoes, which he had never seen before. Seeking an explanation, Alexei decided to check all the locks and windows. Everything was closed as it should be. There was not the slightest sign that anyone could have gotten into the house. This only made him more anxious, because now he couldn't write off what was happening as an intrusion. It was something else, something darker and more elusive. All further attempts to find a logical explanation for what was happening were futile. With each hour of the day, Alexei became more and more convinced that what was happening could not be explained by ordinary logic. He began to feel that something else was present in the house, something that remained invisible and incomprehensible. Toward evening, an almost complete apathy seized him. Alexei felt his will to act fading under the weight of uncertainty and fear. Thoughts of leaving the house began to arise in his mind. But where could he go? His parents weren't due back until tomorrow night. He decided that the last thing he could do was to try to keep track of any changes in the house and record them if possible. However, deep inside, Alexei realized that fighting the unknown might be more dangerous than he had anticipated. As night fell, he prepared himself for a new challenge, hoping he could find answers, or at least keep his sanity until morning. Another restless night filled with inexplicable sounds and heavy thinking, Alexei tried to find some logic in what was happening. His mind tiredly returned to the same question. What or who could be behind these strange events? During the day, the house seemed less threatening, but at night, every corner was filled with the shadow of fear. In the evening, as dusk thickened around the old house, Alexei noticed through the window the approach of an unknown car. It stopped at the gate, but no one got out. Alexei's heart hammered in anticipation and fear. Whoever it was, the arrival of a stranger at a time like this seemed more than strange. Determined not to let fear take over, Alexei stepped outside to get a better look at the car. However, as soon as he got closer, the car slowly moved off and disappeared into the darkness, leaving behind nothing but questions. Attempts to see the license plate number or the driver's face were futile due to the lack of sufficient light. Returning to the house, Alexei tried to find a logical explanation for what had happened. Maybe it was just an errant driver? Or did one of the neighbors decide to check if everything was all right? But deep inside, he felt that it was something more, perhaps related to the unexplained events of the last few days. Trying to distract himself, Alexei decided to start cooking dinner. But his thoughts kept returning to the car and its mysterious driver. After eating, he checked all the locks in the house, this time with special attention, and went up to the second floor to try to get some rest. But the tranquility was short-lived. Suddenly, the house was filled with quiet, barely perceptible sounds of conversation. Alexei froze, listening. The voices sounded as if the source was somewhere very near, but it was not clear where exactly the sound was coming from. He walked cautiously through the rooms on the second floor, but found no one. With each step, the sense of unease grew stronger. The voices seemed to come from the walls, creating the illusion of someone else in the house. Alexei realized that it sounded absurd, but he couldn't deny the obvious. The house was alive with unknown presences. As he approached the stairs leading to the attic, he noticed that the hatch, usually closed, was ajar. Not remembering that any of the household had gone up there recently, Alexei felt that the answers to his questions might be there. Gathering his will into a fist, he slowly made his way toward the attic, preparing to come face to face with the unknown. On the third night, Alexei decided not to try to sleep. Armed with a flashlight and a baseball bat, he sat in the living room, alert to every rustle. Time stretched slowly, and each hour seemed like an eternity. But despite his expectations, the night passed relatively quietly, except for a couple moments when it seemed like someone was whispering directly into his ear. Though turning around, he found no one. However, deep past midnight, when the silence seemed most deafening, a sound came from the outside world that shattered the illusion of safety. A car slowly pulled up to the house, and Alexei, peeking through the curtains, saw a black sedan come to a stop at the gate. He couldn't see the driver because of the reflection of the streetlight on the car windows. Minutes of waiting stretched unbearably. Alexei stood holding his breath, watching the car, but no one got out. After a while, the sedan slowly touched down and disappeared into the darkness. This incident only added questions to the already existing intertwining of mysticism and reality. Alexei tried to find a logical explanation. Maybe it was just a random passerby who took a wrong turn toward their house. But deep down, he knew that nighttime visits in such a secluded place couldn't be an accident. He wrote down the license plate number and time of arrival, hoping it might help him solve the mystery later. After this incident, the night returned to its usual flow. A silence broken only by his own footsteps and rapid breathing. But Alexei's inner tension did not subside. He began to feel that he was becoming part of something much bigger and darker than just night terrors. The next day, Alexei tried not to think about the night events, going about his normal business. But in the evening, his attention was again drawn to the unexplained phenomena. This time, it was voices. He heard them for the first time as he walked past the closed door to the basement. Stopping, he listened. Voices sounded muffled, as if people were talking in the next room, though he was sure there was no one in the house but him. Alexei slowly opened the door to the basement, expecting to see someone there, but the darkness met him with a blank stare. Turning on the light, he went downstairs, his heart pounding in anticipation of encountering the incomprehensible. But the basement was empty, and the voices were hushed as soon as he crossed the threshold. Returning upstairs, he tried to find the source of the sounds, but to no avail. The voices appeared and disappeared, making it seem as if the house was filled with invisible presences. They spoke in an incomprehensible language, giving the impression of a distant and inscrutable conversation. This discovery plunged Alexei into even greater despair. He began to wonder if these phenomena were really taking place, or if his mind was beginning to fail him. With each hour spent waiting for new manifestations of the unknown, he was more and more inclined to think that this night might be the decisive night in the search for answers. As soon as darkness swallowed the last rays of the sunset, Alexei resumed his position in the living room. He was determined to face the night, not as a victim, but as an explorer, eager to unravel the mysteries of his home. He set up tape recorders around the rooms, hoping to catch some evidence of the unusual phenomena that haunted him. Toward midnight, when the house had already fallen to silence, there was an unexpected knock on the door. At first, Alexei thought that his imagination was playing a cruel trick on him. But when the knock repeated, he realized it was reality. With his heart pounding in his chest, he walked to the front door. Peering through the peephole, he saw a dark figure standing on the threshold. With doubt in his voice, he asked who was there, but there was no answer. The knocking continued, insistent and rhythmic. Gathering all his courage, Alexei opened the door, but there was no one behind it. Standing on the threshold, he looked around, but the darkness concealed only emptiness. Walking back into the house, he felt a cold wind run down his back. It was a reminder that what was happening was beyond his comprehension. The knock on the door was only the beginning of a series of strange events that night. Later, there was a noise at the top of the house, as if someone was pacing heavily in the attic. Alexei, armed with a flashlight and a bat, headed toward the sounds, but as before, found no sign of intrusion or the presence of anyone. Returning, he noticed that the door to the basement was now ajar, though he remembered having closed it. Descending, he found that the old dust-covered television, long forgotten and never used, had suddenly turned on, showing only static noise on the screen. The voices he had heard before now seemed louder, coming from the white noise of the television. This night left Alexei's soul with even more questions than answers. He began to feel that he was becoming a pawn in someone else's big, uncharted game, the scenario of which was unknown to him. With each hour spent in vigilance, his determination to seek answers only strengthened, despite all the threats that this mystical mystery entailed. After a series of inexplicable events breaking the silence of the night, Alexei felt completely isolated from the outside world, as if the house had become his prison. This night was no exception. He had almost gotten used to the rustling, whispering, and strange sounds when suddenly there was a clear and decisive knock on the door. The knock took him by surprise. So much in surprise that for a moment he froze, not believing his ears. The time was late at night, and the visit seemed absurd. Gathering his will in a fist, Alexei walked to the door, trying to guess who might be standing behind it. However, when he opened the door, only the emptiness of the dark night stood before him. No sign that anyone had actually been there just a few seconds ago. As he walked back into the house, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The feeling became a constant companion, increasing his paranoia and fear. The night continued to disturb him with new manifestations. Now it was shadows flickering in his field of vision, and the sensation of cold breath on the back of his neck as he passed dark corners. Having exhausted his strength and resources, Alexei realized that the only way to keep his sanity was to confront his fears. He decided to spend the entire night awake, walking around the house and trying to find the source of his worries. But the more he searched, the less he realized what was really going on. As night changed to morning and the first rays of sunlight illuminated the room, Alexei felt temporarily relieved. But that was until he found a strange object in his pocket. An antique brass key that he had never seen before. This key seemed familiar, as if he had seen it in his dreams, or rather in the nightmares that were now his reality. Searching around the house, Alexei found that the key fit into an old chest in the attic that he thought had always been locked. Inside the chest, he found diaries and letters dating back to the early 20th century that belonged to the previous owner of the house, whose family had disappeared without a trace. Reading the diaries, Alexei realized that the house held a dark secret. The family had been the victim of an accident that led to their disappearance, and strange events had been happening in the house ever since. The letters described a series of accidents and strange events that began after they discovered an ancient artifact hidden in the walls of the house. Alexei realized that everything that was happening to him was connected to this artifact and the fate of the previous occupants. He decided that the only way to put an end to these events was to return the artifact to its true place and close the cycle of history that had been broken many years ago. Gathering all his strength, he set out on one last journey through the house to restore order and reconcile with the spirits of the past. As he did this, he felt the tension and anxiety leave him, and the house became quiet and peaceful once again. After Alexei had carried out his decision and returned the artifact to its place, he felt an extraordinary calmness envelope the house. It was a sense of peace he hadn't experienced since these strange events had begun. He spent the rest of the morning savoring the silence that seemed almost sacred to him now. When Alexei's parents returned, they found him sleeping a deep and serene sleep on the couch in the living room. They found it hard to believe the accounts of what had happened over the past few days, especially given the calm that now reigned in the house. Alexei himself began to wonder if it was all a figment of his imagination, brought on by stress and fatigue. However, deep inside, he knew that he had experienced something exceptional that had changed his view of the world and his own perception of reality. The events of those nights left an imprint in his soul, a reminder that the world is full of mysteries, and not all of them can be explained scientifically. In the following days and weeks, Alexei tried to lead a normal life. But in the evenings, when there was silence, his thoughts returned to what had happened. He often caught himself thinking about the fate of the previous occupants of the house and how thin the line between reality and mysticism was. Alexei's story stayed with him as a reminder that sometimes, in order to find answers, you just have to accept the unknown and learn to live with it. He learned that even the most mundane places and situations can hide amazing stories, and that every experience, whether light or dark, is part of the journey to understanding yourself and the world around you. With this realization, Alexei looked to the future with a new curiosity and respect for the unknown, ready to face whatever challenges life would bring. If these dark and absolutely real stories made your heart beat faster, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and leave a like. Your subscription and likes will help us share even more thrilling stories with you. And of course, to make sure you don't miss our next videos with horrifying stories, activate notifications. Join our community of lovers of mysticism and the unknown, and be ready for new portions of adrenaline.